Welcome to The Fabric, a podcast from Lobby Capital. In this podcast, we explore the people we back, the people we work with, and those we partner with in hopes of better understanding what leads to successful entrepreneurship. Recognizing there is no single recipe or list of ingredients in successful entrepreneurs, but instead a combination of past experiences, relationships, serendipity, and personal characteristics that shape and influence their achievements. So through our conversations, we will dissect various case studies in hopes of unraveling the fabric of successful entrepreneurs. Hello, welcome to The Fabric, a podcast by Lobby Capital. I'm Buddy Arnheim, your host, and today we are going to be sitting down and talking with none other than Collin Wallace, the newest partner at Lobby Capital, and I could not be more thrilled to sit down with Colin and chat about Colin's upbringing, his background, his incredible entrepreneurial successes, his investing prowess, and anything else that comes up in between. So, Colin, welcome to the podcast.
Yeah, thanks so much for having me. It's super exciting.
Not only am I excited about the podcast, I'm excited about you joining Lobby Capital. I'm excited about being able to call you a partner. It's so freaking fun.
It's crazy. It's who would have thought? It's
who would have thought?
Although the universe works.
It is, but you know, we've now been spending a lot of time together over the last 6 months or so, and it could not feel more comfortable. Like it's like, you know, just a nice warm blanket that just sort of so many symmetries and so many kind of common perspectives with all four of us.
It's so true. Yeah, I remember the first time meeting David. I think he was teaching in Startup Garage and we were teaching together. I think, you know, that sometimes you get this intuition about people. And I think sometimes there's a perception that there's no logic behind it. And I would almost say it's like logic that it's hard to articulate, right? And so anyways, that intuition was there.
You know, on the podcast, we talked about, you know, some of the best decisions being decisions that almost come subconsciously. They're not completely subconscious because they're built on a lot of research and knowledge gathering, as we were just talking about.
Totally.
But ultimately, the final decision kind of is so comfortable. It's so right that it sort of leaps out of you. And I think that's, you know, at least that's how we felt as we were kind of exploring you joining the partnership. It just was like, why not? Like, that would be crazy not to have it happen.
Yeah, you know, it's funny. So you'll find one of the random things I do is I tend to read white papers just because I'm curious, like, where's the world heading to? And there's always this really big gap between sort of where technology's at and like where the market's ready to adopt. And one of the papers I read was about what portion of your brain is used for what, you know, different tasks. And, you know, come to find out that this massive amount of your brain is being used for all of these like subconscious, you know, processes. And I'm sort of fudging the numbers a little bit. I don't remember exactly, but I would go through this exercise with founders where they do these interviews with, you know, a potential customer, and, you know, the customer would say, oh, well, the reason why I did that is because of X or because of Y. And I would say, well, you can't believe them because in most cases, they don't know why they're doing the thing that they're doing. And I would give them this quiz and I'd say, okay, you know, the average human over the course of, you know, 1 minute, how many thoughts do you think they have? And people say, well, it's, you know, 5,000, 7,000, 8,000. And if I remember correctly, the number was roughly 11,000 like thoughts that you have over the course of a minute.
Wow.
So then the question was, okay, well, how many of those do you think are actually conscious? Like, I'm going to go outside now, or I'm hungry, I'm going to go get some food. And it turns out it's about 30 out of those 11,000 are like you being conscious and saying, I want to do this thing. And the rest of them are like, oh, my blood vessels need to be dilated and I need to blink. And like, oh, don't forget to produce some more cells in this like hair follicle. It's all of that. It's like the massive amount of compute in your brain. So a lot of the things that you're doing, you don't really understand exactly why you're doing them, right? It's sort of like built into your sort of core operating systems.
You know, the two thoughts that leap to mind as you say that. One is, how the heck did they measure 11,000? Like, where did that?
I don't even remember if that's exactly the number. I have to go find the paper.
No, but it's cool. But then the other thing is, I started at my wife's, you know, strong urging. I started meditating about 6 months ago. All right, and it's not. I am not the guy that's going to ever advocate meditation. Like, that is not my personality.
I'm not that guy.
But I'm willing to try anything once. And so I started meditating, and this instructor that she introduced me to was like, okay, here's what you're trying to do. You're trying to get literally no thoughts in your head. And I'm like, oh, how hard could that be? But then you try this meditation thing, and it's like, It's impossible. Okay. There's no way I can get zero thoughts going. So I can now understand and appreciate the practice of meditation, because I think it's exactly that. It's trying to unravel all those 11,000 thoughts in a minute to get them to, from that, you do feel, I will say, now I'm starting to sound like a zealot, but there is something very relaxing and therapeutic about taking, 10 minutes a day and trying to do that. It's actually pretty remarkable.
I think that's right. And, the closest I've gotten is like convenient distractions, like someone poking with needles, or like worrying about your breathing, or like trying not to get run over by a car on the bike. It's like these moments where you have one thought. Right. It's not zero thoughts, but it's like maybe one or two. Right. That's a pretty meaningful contrast to the, regular operating. So I'll take that for now.
Yep.
Yeah.
All right. So let's do this. We're going to ultimately talk at the end about the way you think about investing, because that's one of the things that was so attractive to us as you joined the partnership, how aligned our collective approach is towards investing. But before we get to all that, let's spin that clock backwards, the chronological clock backwards, and get to know sort of a young Colin. So first, where did you grow up?
So I was born in New Hampshire in Hitchcock Hospital at
And how far away is that from Hornick? Like, you guys are both New Hampshire boys.
Not very far at all. My parents were in grad school at Dartmouth. I was born, I think, 3 days after graduation. So clearly they weren't studying as much as they should have been.
Naughty parents. Mom and dad.
Yeah, so we were there for a little bit.
What's amazing is you're the third of five. So they weren't just busy.
They had two, like in business school.
Well done, Mom and Dad.
In the Arctic fridges of New Hampshire. After that, my father got a job at IBM selling mainframes
down in
Baltimore.
So you grew up in and around Baltimore. Talk about your path, your high school, and ultimately how you decided to go to Georgia Tech. And
sure. So I was going to public school like my whole life, and I got an opportunity to go to a private school in Baltimore and play lacrosse. And it's funny. Me and my three older brothers, we had tested to go into this private school. It's called Gilman, when I was going into first grade. And all three of us got in. And the school said, well, look, we can't give you a scholarship for all of the kids. We will give you one scholarship, and you can either split it across all three, or you can send one child. And my parents had to make this decision of, do we send one kid? We know we can't afford to, have one scholarship and send the other two. And so their decision was to send none. And we put us all in the same playing field and so on. And so we all ended up in public school, and we went through that process. And I had a really tough time, actually.
And is this downtown Baltimore? Is this like...
At this point, we had moved into the suburbs. We had moved into a place called Ellicott City.
And were the schools known to be high quality, medium?
The schools were known to be high quality, but it came out later that they were kind of cherry picking the scores. So they would have these standardized tests where they were effectively optional, and they would pick certain students to take them. And so the scores would be very high, but the schools were not a mixed bag. And, I was really bored in school. Ended up going all the way through middle school and public school, get into my freshman year of high school. I'm in public school, finished that year, top of my class, and really still bored. Like, I think I was in the top math classes, for my school, that they offered, and I'm still relatively bored. And I was playing lacrosse at that time too. And so I had a great year in lacrosse, all county and, all these different accolades. And I come home and said, Mom and Dad, I'm in the wrong school. I got to go somewhere else. And my mom says, hey, look, we'll support you. You got to get a scholarship, but we will help you fill out the application and so on. When you're doing that process, the first thing they do is they standardized test you. And so you got to go through that whole thing. And so this next standardized test that I had coming up was actually at Gilman. And so I went to Gilman to do this standardized test, and I get there. My parents drop me off. It's early some Saturday morning to do that. And I'm completely lost. It's a massive campus. There's 7 buildings. I have no idea where anything is, where I'm supposed to be. And so I find this gentleman and ask him, excuse me, do you know where this hall is? I'm supposed to be doing this testing. And someone, he said, oh yeah, sure. I'll walk you over there. It turns out this guy, he's the headmaster of Gilman, and he's talking to me as we're walking over, and he's like, oh, you play lacrosse? Yeah, I played at Princeton, and you seem like a great kid. You ever think about applying to Gilman? And I said, well, I'm probably only gonna be able to go to a school where I can get a scholarship and there's a lot of considerations. So on. He says, well, here's my card. Tell your parents to call me.
Amazing.
And my parents called him and he said, look, let's see if we can make this thing work. Ended up doing well in the interview and they offered me a spot there. And so, I showed up and I was ready to play. And, lacrosse at Gilman is just a whole nother level.
Is it?
I was really good in the public school system. I was good in private school. And the team, when I got to Gilman as a sophomore, our seniors and juniors were basically the entire starting lineup of the Ivy Leagues.
Yeah. When
I was applying to schools, originally I was kind of like, okay, I'll play lacrosse at Penn if I can. I'll follow in mom and dad's footsteps, And I ended up not getting into University of Pennsylvania. I applied for the Jerome Fisher program to do, I think, the joint engineering and Wharton.
Yeah, M&T.
Yeah. I didn't get in. And so, at the same time, I got into Georgia Tech. And so, the lacrosse coach.
Have you ever been down to Atlanta?
I've never been to Atlanta.
Yeah, wow.
Not once. And, it was right when that Jermaine Dupri song came out, the Welcome to Atlanta.
Yeah,
and I went down for a recruiting trip. Recruiting's another one of those things where it's like the view of campus and the city that you get as a recruit is so different than the reality. You would have thought that Georgia Tech was like University of Miami, the way I got treated when I got down there. Just parties and clubs and Waffle House. And I was 17 at the time. And it just was just the coolest. I just thought it was the coolest place ever. I came back, was like, I'm going to Georgia Tech,
done.
Which I guess is the point, right? That is the goal. Yeah, I ended up going there. I enrolled as electrical engineer. I did not love it. And I still missed the art element. I still miss that
interesting
creativity piece. There's not a ton.
Did you get to take any electives?
Very few. So Georgia Tech is pretty strict about prescribing sort of like what you need in order to meet requirements for the degree. And at some point, I realized that there were other majors there that I could take that would let you have a little more creativity around your classes. And so one of them was building construction. And so I go and petition mom and dad, hey, can I switch my major to building construction? That was absolute no. We're not sending you to Georgia Tech to be a contractor. And so the other option was mechanical engineering, where they had drafting classes and all these other things. And so the compromise with my father was to do both, so that if I wanted to add mechanical engineering as a second degree, then I could do that. And that was, sort of the best compromise. Yeah. So my options for electives became even smaller because the overlap between these two is really tiny. Yeah. So I ended up dropping EE right before I graduated. I think maybe 4 months before I graduated. At that point, I was off to the races. I had great grades. My parents weren't so worried about me.
Right.
And so I have a mechanical engineering degree and a whole bunch of unused EE credits from Georgia Tech.
And then you graduated college and then you didn't go straight to B school. You started.
No, I started trying to find myself. Yeah, is probably the best way to describe it. So when I was a senior in school, I was sitting in a class. I had a mandatory class for mechanical engineering called pulp and paper making. It was literally how to chew up trees and turn it into paper. It was a mandatory class. And right after this class, I'd have lacrosse practice every day. And so this lecture is 3 hours long. And so if you didn't eat during that lecture and you had practice and you were running wind sprints and all that for another 3 hours, you were just going to be a mess. And so I ended up getting to class late. I didn't have any food. So I text messaged a buddy and I said, hey, can you bring me some food? And we had just gotten this Firehouse subs, had come to campus maybe a few months before. So I asked, hey, can you bring me a Firehouse sub? And, I'll pay for yours if you do it. And my buddy says, hey, I'm already late. I can't go to Firehouse to bring you a sandwich. But I thought to myself, what a great idea. You should be able to text message and have people bring you food.
Right.
And this is 2006, right? So at that time, it's a pretty novel idea. And so I start working on this concept called text order go. This tells you my marketing prowess at the time. You literally would text for food and someone would bring it to you and deliver it in class. And I started writing a patent for this idea and started building the product for it. And the way it worked It's written for BlackBerry OS. This is,
oh my God,
dating myself.
Totally awesome.
It was an applet that would run on your phone, and it would take your order and it would convert it to binary, and then it would text message that binary to a server, and the server would decode the binary and then fax an order to a restaurant. And the logic was like, people didn't have data in 2006. Right. It wasn't like you just used a data plan. Like,
no, you were scared. You used it sparingly.
Totally. But everyone had text messages.
Right.
So you just turn it into a bunch of ones and zeros and send that to a server. And that's how we would communicate. And so it turned out this is a horrible business, like for classrooms. Professors hated it. Students were poor. Like there's just a lot of issues with it. But it worked really well in stadiums and arenas where people like didn't want to wait in line for hot dogs and hamburgers and that kind of thing. And so, started working on this thing, and then sort of the world fell apart. 2007, like financial crisis starts,
GFC.
like job market starts getting really tight, and things just start looking really cloudy. And so I completely shift gears. I'm just like, this is just fun time. It's not a real like thing. I need to go find a real job. And so I end up getting a job for Lexmark International, basically in their hardware division, where it turns out that you needed somebody who both understood hardware, the mechanical engineering side, and the electrical boxes and sort of the electrical elements of the printers. And then also all the manufacturing was in China. And I was one of the few people that spoke Chinese.
And when did you start studying Chinese? Was that at Georgia Tech or Gilman?
Totally jumped over that. Yes, it was at Georgia Tech.
It was.
Okay, so Georgia created this policy where they were using the lottery money to send kids to school for free, right? Give them full scholarship called Hope Scholarship. And the requirements for it was that you needed to have a 3.0 or more in high school before matriculating to college. What they didn't anticipate was that many instructors were going to basically change the grades like for kids in order to help them get into college, right? Because no one wants to be the teacher that
right.
keeps
They gave them the BC, right?
Totally. And so the population was way higher than what they were expecting for colleges. So they started trying to like get kids to go to school elsewhere. And they created all these partnerships, sort of abroad programs with different schools in different countries, where the allure was, go to this other program. We are not going to charge you anymore for tuition. You can pay in-state tuition the same way you would here. What they didn't realize is kids like myself who were coming from Maryland and like New York and wherever else, we weren't on in-state tuition anyway. We were paying $15,000 a semester to go to school, and the Georgia kids were paying like $1,200. And so by going to school overseas, we could pay the $1,200 and we were still getting scholarship money from the lacrosse team and so on, like based on, some of the other expenses that we had. So you could actually get paid to go to school. So myself and many of my out-of-state lacrosse teammates, we would basically go abroad every semester. We weren't in season. And so one of the years, I think in 2005, we went to China and we were in Shanghai for 4 months or 5 months. Yeah, we started learning Chinese and we took thermodynamics and econ and a whole bunch of other classes.
Was it through like an affiliated university?
Yeah, it was at Jiaotong Daxue, which is Shanghai University, basically, which is probably like the Yale of China. I mean, it's like, I didn't realize it at the time. I mean, this is like one of the top schools. I mean, certainly the top 3 schools in China.
Neat.
And so like, not only do you learn Chinese and you have this like wonderful experience, because I know China just seemed interesting. I always liked Kung Fu movies, which is a weird, like that would be a reason why. And so anyways, when I graduated from college, Lexmark was looking for someone that looked a lot like me. And so I ended up taking that role. And I would spend half of my time in Lexington, Kentucky, like sort of doing designs for different printer boxes and inkjet printers. And then I would fly over to Hong Kong and I would stay there as we would do builds. And I had a factory that was basically responsible for in Xinxi, China, just outside of Shenzhen. And so I would commute across the border. We'd go and stay in the factory and debug machines and like injection molding issues and all that kind of stuff. And our partner was Foxconn and Foxlink, like who would go on to create the iPhone and sort of like build. Yeah, so a lot of those people I worked with actually became executives like in Foxconn and producing the iPhone. And
really amazing
it's
experience.
Such a small world.
And that it's interesting. So that you had the engineering background, but this is obviously bringing you into this sort of tech economy with kind of that crazy, interesting international flair. When you would go back and forth, like how much time would you spend in China and how good did your language skills get?
I would spend a month to 2 months in China each time.
Yeah, wow.
And my language skills got to be pretty good. Language is largely like memorization with a little bit of like art. And I was always really good at memorizing. So that part worked pretty well. The challenge is that Chinese you're learning is very specific to like manufacturing. So you'd learn things like, oh, the tolerance is off on this part, but you wouldn't know how to say like my soup is too hot,
Interesting.
And so it wasn't until later that I actually started to learn
rounding it out.
Yeah, exactly.
Is it Mandarin? Was it Mandarin?
It's Mandarin.
It was Mandarin. Yep.
Yeah, it was we call putonghua, which sounds kind of like you're talking to a pirate. It's like a very harsh form of Chinese, but it's like the traditional Chinese. My wife speaks Cantonese, and when she hears it, it's like you could see her face kind of like wince up.
It's a little more rough. It's like,
yeah, totally.
It's like a heavy New York accent.
Exactly. Exactly.
I have not studied Chinese. I speak Italian, but I have taken one class in Chinese just to sort of try to understand.
Yeah.
And what's so amazing to me is the intonation, like that one word, depending on how you end the sort of the intonation defines the word. So how you turn Western ears to understand and hear that is amazing to me. I think it's got to be one of the hardest languages to learn.
Yeah. So Cantonese, like for my wife, they have 9 tones.
9?
Traditional sort of putonghua has 5. I think the big breakthrough for me was realizing we have all of those tones in English. We just don't necessarily pay attention to them. Like if I were to say, oh, it's very different than to say, oh.
Right.
Like the difference between those two things, and it's all because of that tone. And so each of the 5 tones in Chinese actually maps to something like that we would say like, what? Like that is 3rd tone in Chinese, or oh, that's 2nd tone, right? Like it's sort of finding these parallels. And it's interesting because again, all of these things map to even what we do today, like in lobby, where it's effectively pattern matching in a lot of ways. It's like, what's new about this AI thing that's not that new? That was the same thing with Hayes modems. That was the same thing with transistors. That was the same thing with the telegraph, right? Like everyone says sort of each time it's different, but each time it's kind of not.
Right.
It's kind of the same thing, different players,
And it's interesting. So this is kind of a leap, but the more diversity of knowledge you gather, the easier it is for you to pick those patterns and do the pattern matching. So all you youngsters out there that are listening, because I know there's thousands of people listening to this podcast, make sure that you have that hungry mind. Don't ever quell that hunger. Just sort of feed it.
And to your point, it's not obvious how these pieces fit together. And so if you go into it saying like, well, why would I go to China? How's that going to fit into my 10-year career plan?
Right.
I have no idea.
Right.
It doesn't really
But it was super
matter.
interesting.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
If nothing else, what you'll take away from it is some other opportunity to grow, right? Some new seam where you can expand into. And some of the best things and most impactful things I've learned came from those experiences where I wasn't chasing anything. You were just curious.
I will say the folks that I view as the best venture capitalists, including our partner, David, who I think is amazing. There's no way you could ever predicted that his computer music undergrad degree would lead him to be sort of a Midas touch venture capitalist. And I think it's this diversity of thinking and diversity of experiences and this random walk that's in many regards random, and yet it's constantly looking out for that next opportunity, not thinking what's the final goal, but just what's the next step. Yep. Okay, so you kicked butt at Georgia Tech.
Yeah.
You were a rock star athlete and academic. You end up going to Lexmark. You have this incredible experience between Kentucky and Shanghai. How long did you stay there, and then what happened?
So when I got there, my first week of work, they had a company-wide meeting, and they sat everyone down, and they announced that they were laying off a quarter of the company.
Wow.
This is like fall of 2007.
Right before the GFC.
Yeah. So it was like right when it was starting to, like, you're starting to see things dry up, like orders were starting to dry up, and they could kind of see it at the corporate level. And I remember my manager sitting down with me and saying, well, look, we're not sure how everyone's going to reshuffle. And so what we'd like you to do is kind of stay put, just kind of stay busy for a little while we figure out where all the new hires are going to go. And that process ended up being 6 months almost. So for 6 months, I was
you
sitting
bored?
there,
Were
just
you
showing up, doing nothing? And so I started working on this idea again of like text order go. And like, I thought, okay, well, I'm sitting in a lab all day. I might as well program a little bit. And so I started writing more on these applications. I started refining like some of the methodologies. I went and filed this patent, which my mom was encouraging me for months and months and months to do. And finally she said, I'll pay for it. If you file it, I will pay for it. And I ended up filing this patent, and I needed someone to test it. And so I went down the street to University of Kentucky, and I was able to finagle a little meeting with the mayor of the city through this guy, Jim Host, who was one of the founders of IMG. I don't know if you, IMG,
yeah, sure.
Yeah. So Jim Host, or Host Communications, was basically the first company that recognized that there was value in selling advertising in college sports. And so what they would do is they would go to a university and they'd say, well, there's a lot of volatility in whether or not you can get sponsors. Why don't you sell me the rights to broadcast all of your basketball games? And then I will take the responsibility for reselling them. So Jim would come in and he'd buy the rights, from University of Kentucky or Ohio State or you name it for, $2 million or $5 million for 10 years. And then he'd turn around and sell them for $100 million, to Coca-Cola, business, and Russell Sports, and you name it. And he just created the whole industry, right? He was the guy in Lexington, Kentucky. And so I'll never forget, Jim says, okay, you want to meet with me? His assistant tells me this. You need to come meet Jim at 5 a.m. And so I'm in like this 3-piece suit in downtown Lexington, Kentucky, waiting outside of his office. His assistant lets me in, and he's sitting at his desk. He's reading the newspaper. He's probably been up for an hour at that point. And I start pitching him on like why, University of Kentucky should trial this thing. And like, I really appreciate his help and so on. And his desk has nothing. It's just a pad of paper and a telephone. It's it. No computer, no nothing. And, Jim proceeds to tell me that this technology will never work because telephones aren't able to communicate across carriers. And so, you'll never be able to send, order, and just doesn't understand how this will possibly work and doesn't see it. However, he says, I like you, and I'm willing to make an introduction for you to Rupp Arena, which was University of Kentucky's basketball facility. So I go in and give this pitch, and I say, look, just try it in the student section. Like, no one has to know. I just want to, see if it works. And I think this might actually be really valuable. I run this demo for them live, like in that office, where I have a bunch of food, sort of brought to them and so on. Everyone thinks this is great. And so we end up running this pilot in the University of Kentucky student section. And then about 2 weeks later, I get this call from the team at Rupp Arena. And they say, Colin, we've had some complaints about the solution. And I'm like, oh, crap. I'm at work, by the way. I'm at Lexmark when I get this call. So it's not like, I could just like pop out. I'm like in the bathroom taking this call. And they said, well, we've had complaints from our season ticket holders that they can't do this and only the students can. They don't even pay for their seats, right? So how fast can we expand? And so we started expanding into that facility. And so I was in this weird spot with Lexmark where I was kind of doing my job because I needed to, but also like wasn't super passionate about it. And I was really interested with some of the sort of heat that I was getting from what was called Text Order Go at the time and later became Fango, like fans going to get food and so on. And if we fast forward 2009, Lexmark decides to do another round of layoffs. And so I was actually part.
So you were with you did this on the side for 2 years.
Running both for 2 years.
Yeah, wow.
I kind of knew.
Did you ever hire anybody to help you?
I did. Yeah. I had a whole team.
Good job.
I had a whole bunch of people, and I'd show up to work at 5 or 6 a.m. I'd work till like 2 in the afternoon, and then I'd go home and I'd work on this until I basically passed out at my desk. And I did that for a year and a half.
Great. Where
it came to a head was I got an interview request for one of the local news stations, and we were trying to keep growing. So I'm like, going to go to this interview and so on. And it's 6 o'clock in the morning, and I'm assuming like no one's up at Lexmark at that time. Like people kind of casually stroll in around 9 o'clock, 9:30, 10 o'clock. It's like that kind of like work environment. And of course, the day that this broadcast is supposed to air, there is a snowstorm. And so all of the schools are delayed in their opening while they like plow the roads and so on. And so the whole early morning coverage is on school openings and closings. So what they do is they push the broadcast until basically like 8:30, 9 o'clock, right when everybody's like getting their kids up and like eating breakfast and so on.
So everybody heard
like
it.
prime time. walk into the office and everyone's like, hey, saw you on TV this morning, like, cool idea.
Right.
And, my boss, he's kind of like, oh, I didn't realize you were working in a whole nother company, like while you were also supposed to be working for us here. And I thought like, oh, okay, this is probably the beginning of the end.
Right.
Probably better that way. But 2 weeks later, I got the pink slip. And thanks to President Obama, when I left, I got healthcare for 18 months. And, I got a severance at that point. What they were doing is they were giving you 1 month of salary for every year of service, but a minimum of 6 months.
Great.
Yeah. So I ended up getting a bunch of cash, and I plowed that all into the business, raised some more cash. And then from there, we ended up getting an offer to be in Accelerate Labs, which became TechStars in Chicago. Mm-hmm. And that's what got me out of Kentucky and into Chicago. And I met Sam Yegan there and Troy Hennicoff, and they sort of took me under their wing and showed me how to build a real business. We pivoted a whole bunch. We ended up testing, not just stadiums and arenas, but also hotels, airports, casinos, and restaurants, which we hadn't fully thought through at that point, but we knew it was going to be interesting. And it turned out that the restaurants started growing way faster than everything else. And so our plan for distribution was partnerships. That was kind of how we grew, right? In stadiums, we partnered with Centerplate and Aramark and Sodexo, and with Marriott on like room service and hotels and Delta Airlines and the airports. And there was an early online ordering and menu listing service called Grubhub that was in Chicago. And so we reached out and we said, hey, like, let's partner. Like, we have this great technology. You can use your phone. You can order stuff. We had built a ton of tech to be able to integrate into point of sale systems because in the stadiums and arenas, they're all interconnected. You can't just like send stuff to a fax machine. It's got to go into this central repository so that people can get paid out and the team can get what their piece is. Everyone else keep eyes on everyone else to make sure they're not getting cheated out of those hot dog or beer sales.
Everybody's got a piece.
Totally. So we had all those integrations and we had a bunch of patents, and we ended up, meeting with them to partner, and they wanted the technology exclusively. And we said, well, we can't give it to you exclusive. We have all these other partnerships. And they said, well, what if we just merge the two companies together and we can go after this space as like one combined entity?
And was this before Grubhub had gone public?
This is way before. This is spring of 2011. And we had just raised a round of money. And literally the day before we went into this meeting with Grubhub, we had just closed. And by that Sunday, I had a term sheet from them to buy the business.
Great.
And I was 25 and kind of never looked back.
So a bunch of questions are parking right on that. So first is, where did the idea of applying to Accelerate / TechStars, where did that come into your mind?
Oh, yeah.
Because there's a lot of the people that are going to listen to this probably understand the sort of ethos of Silicon Valley and raising venture capital and tech startups and blah, blah, blah. But hopefully there are some people out there that this is new to. And like, that's a different mindset, right? There's starting a company, and then there's starting a company that you're seeking to really scale, like different risk profiles, different energy levels. Like, how did you come up with Accelerate / TechStars?
So in my case, it was really strange because I had a friend from undergrad who was at University of Chicago booth, and we would constantly talk about the business. I mean, he was just this guy, David Ward, who was an executive at Amazon now. David would constantly give ideas and really support me a ton as a founder. And he says, hey, we got this program here. They were just advertising at booth called Accelerate Labs.
Okay.
I think you should do it. I said, okay, well, what's the catch? He says, well, they take 5% of your company. I said, oh, that sounds like a scam, right? And at that point, I had met with a lot of people who would say, oh, I'll help you raise money for 2% or 3% of how much I raise. And it became really clear to me that those were kind of just grifters. Those were not like serious people. And so this felt a lot like that. And so my response to David was, well, look, if you fill out the application, like maybe I'll come to the interview, but I'm not going to waste time on this. Like, we have clients to sign. We have these partnerships with Micros and Radiant, these major point of sale providers. Like, this is a waste of time. Yeah. And so David, to his credit, man,
he applied for you.
He applied for me. He did the whole application. And then, when we get the call that we were, have an interview, I was kind of like, I'm busy right now. I don't think I have time. And he said, look, I put my name on this, like my reputation. Yeah. You got to at least show up. Like, it's the least you can do. And so I showed up to this call with Sam and Troy, like basically expecting to blow them off. Right. Just like, yeah, okay, what do you guys want? Like, we're good. We don't need anything. And they gave a very compelling pitch and a very compelling approach of what they could do. The way I would describe it is, most founders think that the problems in their business are money problems. They think if I just have more cash, then like everything will be fine and up and to the right. And they don't realize that capital is incredibly efficient, right? There's one thing that capital loves, it's to make more capital. And so like if capital's not coming into your business, it's almost always there's something else wrong, right? That there's something impaired about the business that's preventing capital from wanting to find a home there. And that was the thing I think that Sam and Troy understood was you need to come and spend time with us so that we can debug what's wrong with the business. And then fundraising will be the byproduct of that, but that's not necessarily the goal of you coming in here. And so I had a chance to talk to some of the other founders that I had worked with. One was David Lieb, who did Bump.
Yep, sure.
And who actually, ironically, I saw years
Another
later.
YC graduate.
Yeah, he's a YC now. Yeah. He's a partner now. And, they did Bump, you bump the two devices together and you transfer information. And they raised a bunch of cash. And
there's a lot of cash.
Yeah.
I remember that one.
They ended up getting bought by Google, becoming Google Photos. And David had a great career there. And then, was obviously at YC now. But I had a chance to talk to him and he was amazing and said, look, Sam and Troy are awesome. Like you should totally do this. If I were to do Accelerator again, I'd give them 10%, not 5%. Those are pretty profound, strong words, from another founder. The other was the team from Next Big Sound. They also had a really strong review of, Troy and Sam. And so I said, okay, let's try it. Worst comes to worst, maybe our business doesn't work out and I go work for one of these other really smart founders. And so it just seemed like the right thing to do. Went up there and had an amazing experience. I mean, it literally changed my life, so.
I mean, it's so interesting to me because, I think I see the kids out here that grew up out here and sort of are just kind of exposed to this startup thing, or you see the kids at Stanford, especially 10 years ago or 15 years ago, there wasn't the same awareness outside of this little bubble about what this thing, this startup company, the little piece of a big pie versus big piece of a little pie, venture capital, like good for you for just having that awareness. And I mean, good for Sam and Troy for introducing it to you. But that's such a cool journey. It's such an unusual path in, and yet, in my mind, you're sort of now, you're like the nucleus of this. Like, it's wild.
Somehow I've managed to work my way into the center. I think it has changed a lot for good and bad. Yeah. Like at that time, I knew one VC. Right. There was a guy, Phil Furneaux, like Borealis Ventures, I want to say, in New Hampshire. This guy went to business school with my father. It's the only VC I ever knew of or heard of or anything along those lines. And was very, very kind to take a pitch from me and sort of give me feedback and all those kinds of things. But I think part of the challenge for founders nowadays is because there's more information and because it's more widespread, in many ways, they can think that they're further along than they are. They think that they know more than they do. And I think it's compounded by the fact that when we were building Fango, it was really hard, to get a business started. But once you got it going, it was a lot easier to grow it, right? Like clicks on Facebook were cheap. Google, you could, index very highly, like relatively easy. And at some point though, it switched where now it's really easy to spin up, a server. You can go to AWS and like you could be up and running in days, right? You use Squarespace for your website. You don't have to code anything. You use Zapier for your integrations, but now it's really hard to grow. And so you can do a lot to simulate success early in that business and not have to expend a lot of resources. And so you see a lot of companies now where they feel like they've got a lot and they sort of have a little swag, like they've got a lot. But when you sort of pull back the hood, you realize it's
business is still missing.
Yeah, there's still a lot of like bubble gum and paper clips. And so I think part of the reason why we were successful is because we had an intellectually honest appreciation for where we were. We were able to sort of come to grips with it. And that helped us plot the path to where we wanted to be. And so it's one of those things I encourage founders now is like to be real with yourself, be real with your investors, because we don't bet on companies. We partner with them. Like the idea is that we're in this together. You win, we win. Right. And so there's no point in BSing us any more than us BSing you.
Yeah. I mean, I think the most miserable emotion you can feel is when you bring on an investor that has a false perception of what they just jumped into.
Totally.
Because that's just a recipe for acrimony for years to come. And frankly, I don't think I can point to any big successes that had that as a semblance of the starting point for an investor. None. Like even the most controversial or sort of flamboyant or volatile founders that have been successful still had and have very honest relationships with their investors. Like otherwise it does not work.
You have to.
Yeah.
You know, I think about it like you have multiple fronts to fight on as a founder, right? You've got your employees that you've got to keep happy. Maybe your fights with your co-founder and conflicts there. You have competitors who like always hope that you die quickly, you know, and
customers that want something.
Totally. They want money back or they want to pay less money. And then you've got your investors. And you know, if you're a really good founder, you can probably fight on two of those fronts at a time. More than that, you're going down.
You're down.
And so like in many ways, you have to think about like, how do I neutralize some of these fronts so that I can focus on the things that are not negotiable? Competition, not negotiable. You have to fight there.
Yep.
Right. And so you got to pick what's your other thing going to be. And if it's your investor that you've got to watch your back on.
And what kind of value does that even bring to your business if you win that fight? None, zero. You know, so you end up going to Grubhub and you worked there for about a year, right?
Yeah.
And
so ran innovation.
And the head of innovation, and that to just run the timeline when they went public and sort of where they were during that year.
So when they went public, I was actually in business school.
Okay.
So when I was doing the deal with Grubhub, I had a very different view of myself and like my role and sort of like what happens in like M&A transactions. And I thought to myself that what you get out the other side is this happy mix of like two companies. It's like this beautiful blend, the best of both worlds.
It's like Bordeaux.
Chocolate and the peanut butter. And that's not what happens, right? Like somebody gets bought and someone does the buying. And when the dust settles, you realize that this thing that you index really heavily on, which in my case was freedom, you don't have a lot of, right? Your opinion becomes optional. And I think the thing that was really frustrating for me was there were a lot of commitments that I made in order to get our company to where it was. And I didn't have the power anymore to
follow through on
those things. You do what you say you're going to do. And then you're in this position where you don't have the power to do that. And that just ate me up. It was frustrating. I probably reflected that when I was at work and in the office. And then you combine that with some of the hubris and swag, right, that comes from stepping up to the plate effectively for my first company and hitting a quote unquote home run, right? And in my mind, I thought, well, you know what? I don't need this. Like I can just leave and I'll do it again. You know, why not? And I've certainly learned since then it's much harder than
so easy.
Yeah, much harder than maybe I thought.
Fingers.
You know, I was really lucky because I had, you know, these mentors like Sam and Troy, and I went to Sam and I said, you know, I'm not super happy. Like I just feel like I've lost control over, you know, what my day-to-day looks like, what I'm working on. Sam says, well, I think maybe it's time for you to go to business school.
Love it.
I said, where should I go to school, Sam? He's like, I don't know, maybe Stanford. And I said, Sam, I'll never get into Stanford. And he says, well, what do I know? You know, fine. If you don't want to apply, then don't apply.
That's, you got Sam down pretty well there.
That's Sam for, I'm not going to argue with you,
right?
But I'm usually the smartest guy in the room.
And I'm giving you my opinion.
And I'm giving you, I'm giving you a hint. I'm usually the smartest guy in the room. You can take it if you want. And I knew Sam well enough to know, like, when I do what he asked me to do, like, good things happen. And it's another one of those things about having great mentors that you have that level of trust that's like, I can't see it, but maybe you can. Mm-hmm. And so I'm just going to trust and obey. You know, Sam said, here's the deal. You need to go and take the GMAT and you need to, you know, get these essays written and so on. And we decided that I was going to apply to business school 11 days before the application was due. So in 11 days, I wrote my application, got my referral letters, and did the GMAT.
Wow.
Turned it in, second round of at Stanford, spring of 2012, and ended up getting in.
Yeah. And at that time, had you ever spent any time out in Palo Alto or nothing? Never been
I came out here once to raise money, and it was a horrible experience, right? I didn't know how to pitch well. And, you know, I pitched Emily Melton. She was at Mayfield at the time, Charles Moldau, DFJ. And, you know, it was all kind of lackluster. It kind of just didn't hit the mark. I wasn't ready. I realized in hindsight. And they were all very gracious and so on. Emily was great. She gave some great feedback and so on. And it was cool to see some of these people later, because a lot of them went to Stanford. And so I ended up running into them at various like events and so on, like years later. And at that point, you know, Grubhub, we had gone public and we just had great returns and so on. So it was cool to see the stories sort of come full circle.
Yeah. Fantastic. So you went to GSB, graduated a couple of years later. And what would you say the most valuable things that came out of your Stanford education?
The most valuable thing, I think, for many students at Stanford is a class called OB 374, which is organizational behavior and interpersonal dynamics. And it's colloquially known as touchy-feely. I think the big insight that Stanford has in the business school is for most of the students who attend, the limiting factor for them is not going to be their intelligence, their skill sets, or opportunity. The limiting factor will be them. It will be literally their own mentality and how much people want to work with them and help them and so on. Right? The higher you move up in an organization, the less you can tell people what to do, the more you have to work with people, the more they have to want to, you know, be a part of your team. And so learning to understand or learning how to sort of manage those interpersonal dynamics, understand how you're motivated, how others are motivated, what really matters to you, is a huge piece of that curriculum. And I think that was the big unlock, was for all intents and purposes at that point in my life, I was retired. Like, I didn't really have to work or do anything at that point, but I was also really unhappy. I just was...
You wanted to do something.
Totally.
Yeah.
And so Stanford was this huge opportunity to sort of refocus and to see what else was out there, nonprofits and private equity and venture capital. I had no understanding of any of these things. I knew engineering and I knew, you know, my time at Grubhub and sort of the early stages of the business building. And so it let me see a lot of other things and meet a lot of people who are working in different parts of the ecosystem. And I'm very, very grateful for it.
You know, it's interesting. We run across so many people out here that have had early success, right? They hit it big early in life. And sometimes it's because they're the entrepreneur and they started the business and the business was successful, as is the case with you. Sometimes it's they join the right company and ride it up. You know, and so it's a unique and very sort of luxurious position to be in when you're sort of, you know, 30 or sub 30 and financially set for a while. But you said an interesting thing, which is you weren't happy. And I hear that often, right? A lot of young people sort of have this ambition to make money. And then when they make it, they're like, wait, the journey was fun, not the destination. And how do I get back to that journey? How do I replicate that journey? And so you come out of business school. What was your mindset and how did that, you know, guide you into sort of the next thing you did?
Yeah, I think the biggest change in my mentality was being more purposeful about how I spent my time, my energy, my talent. You know, one of the things I realized, you know, with Grubhub and sort of Fango merging into Grubhub, when you're successful at this startup thing, you make a lot of money for a lot of people around you, employees, for your investors, for your board, you name it. And you have a lot of agency around who that money goes to, who that value goes to. And you can choose to apply your effort and your energy, you know, to create resources and create money and opportunity for people who share values that you share, or you cannot. You can be ambivalent about it and just say like, oh, I'll take whoever writes me a check and I'll work with whoever and wherever I can make money. I realized that was the thing that made me unhappy was that if I was using my time and energy to create products I didn't care about, serve customers that didn't really matter, and to put money in people's pockets that didn't really care about me or my community or that kind of thing, that was sort of the third rail. That was not interesting for me. It was really demotivating. And so in many ways, kind of bringing it full circle in some ways, like Lobby represents a lot of those values and the same values that I had around like, what is the impact of this? Like, what is my impact on these people? Like, what matters in terms of this community and this relationship? And how is that reflected in founders that I'm putting money into? Even when I was writing personal checks in the companies, I mean, there were a bunch of companies where it's like, I don't totally get this idea, but I get you. And I understand that you're going to run through walls. And so I think you deserve a shot. I'm going to write you a check. And those have been some of my best investments, right? And so I think that's the piece that changed, is being more human capital oriented, both in building and in terms of investing than I was prior to business school.
Yeah, time and time again, it is clear that, yes, you have to have a great product. Yes, you have to have a market that's growing or going through turmoil that's large enough. But time and time again, it's the people. And, whether it becomes $1 billion outcome or just a really great outcome, I believe there's a lot of luck in that one. But great people find that path more often than not. And what makes a person great, which is, kind of the gist of this whole podcast, is to try to sort of recognize that great in one person can be totally different than great in another. But it is about finding those people. And then the joy of this job, and I'd say the joy of Silicon Valley, because it's not just being a VC. It could be as a lawyer, I enjoyed it, or as an entrepreneur, I enjoyed it. It's working with these great people, like being around them and appreciating their strengths and their superpowers and kind of, faking that you have your own superpowers in my instance. When we have our offsites as Lobby Capital and we think about sort of who we are and what our mission is and sort of how we differentiate, time and time again, it's this human capital thing. It really is.
That's the big unlock. I feel like the new age of founders, they're more deliberate about it too. They're coming in and saying like, okay, look, this $5 million spends the same, whether it comes from this name, that name, or the other. Who's actually going to care about what happens to me or care about the things that I care about or care about my values? And I think that's where they're making the decisions, or at least is where they should be from my perspective. And so, I mean, to your point, it's if you dig deep enough on any problem, it's a people problem.
Eric says something that I just love. I love it. He says it with his Chicago accent, which makes it even more endearing. But he said, people ask us if we're founder friendly. And the answer is no, we're founder authentic. I love that because maybe it's so Eric, but I think it's Lobby. I think it's a good entrepreneur does not look for his or her or their resources to just be yes men or yes people. They're looking for a very accurate mirror that allows them to see themselves, see their strengths and see their weaknesses. And that, if we're good at our job, I think that's what we do the best at.
I think that's right. I'm not here to be your friend. I'm here to help you.
Mm-hmm. And it's what Sam did for you. Like Sam didn't sugarcoat stuff.
No, Sam didn't. No,
never.
When I got the offer from Grubhub to do the deal, I remember Sam pulling me into his office and I'm super excited to tell him, Sam, we got this offer to sell a business. And Sam says, well, there's 2 times you sell your business. The first is when you're overvalued. And the second is when you're completely fucked. Now, which one are you? And I remember sitting there saying like, that's not the response I was expecting here. And being relatively perplexed that like, I don't know. I think we might be overvalued. Yes, Sam never pulled punches, which I appreciate to this day.
I love that. I love that binary perspective. That's fantastic. Okay, so you finish up B school. You've got this sort of sharper vision and sharper understanding of what you're interested in, what you're not interested in. When did YC come into it? Sort of lay out that next path.
Yeah, so I decided I was going to build another company. And it's kind of like getting the band back together in a way, because what we were building was marketing automation tools for restaurants.
And was it the same people? Were these co-founders and early employees the same?
Yeah, exactly. So my co-founder was the first engineer I hired when we were building Fango and part of what became, Grubhub. He had moved out here and was leading a team at VMware. And so it was kind of like, hey, let's storyboard a couple of things. Let's work on a couple of projects. And we had built a bunch of little stuff on the side. And we decided to build this company, what became Zero Storefront. And, I wasn't going to do an accelerator. It was kind of like, well, I think we've gotten what we need out of TechStars and in sort of Accelerate Labs. And for my co-founder, he hadn't had that experience. He had been in Accelerate Labs, but really as an employee. So I think he was kind of insulated from a lot of, the value. And I really wanted him to have that, and he wanted it for himself. And so we decided we were going to do it, even though we had $2 million at the time. It was kind of like, okay, let's do YC. I think it'll be fun.
And this was 2000.
This is 2019.
2019. And was there ever in your mind, I mean, I am in awe of YC, and I've had sort of the good fortune to invest in a bunch of YC companies. I've gotten to know in a light way Paul and Jessica, and I just think it's,
great.
I mean, to me, it's the preeminent accelerator program. And so it's almost like going to Harvard or Stanford, or maybe it is. Maybe it's even more so like that. Was that a part of your thought, or was it, no, hey, what do I need for this specific business? Like, how much of it was specific to your startup versus, hey, this is a cool experience to go through?
Yeah, it was just another seam to grow into. I actually had no sense of how this would play in the grand scheme of things, just like many of the other decisions, right? It just seems net positive and generally in the right direction. And it ended up being way more impactful than I thought it would be, but also for reasons that were different than I thought.
Okay.
Right. So one example was I made a ton of investments when into YC. I mean, I had cash and, I had that kind of flexibility, and many of those investments have done extremely well, right? Certainly better than our own company did. I think, we'll see. But
right.
At least on paper, much better than, our own company did. There's this book, it's called Finite Infinite Games by a guy named James Carse. And, sort of the TLDR on it is there are two types of games in the world. There's finite games where the objective is to end the game, and there are infinite games where the objective is to keep the game going. So like a finite game would be something like Monopoly, right? Where you take the other person's money and the game is over. And infinite game would be something like Tag, where
Dungeons and Dragons.
Yeah, I tag you, you tag me, and there's not really an end to it. And what you find is that really good things happen when you apply a finite game strategy to a finite game, or an infinite game strategy to an infinite game. But really bad things happen when they're inverted, right? So you're playing Monopoly and you decide, I'm never going to charge anyone, and the game goes on forever. Everyone gets annoyed, and it's not very fun, right? Or you're playing tag and someone says, let's just try to break everyone's legs. And then, the game will be over, and it's not very fun for people either. And in many ways, I looked at my post-GSB career as being this infinite game where the strategy was one where you were trying to keep the game going and you were making decisions with that long-term perspective in mind, where I had no idea what the value of YC was going to be over the next 2 months or the next 2 years or even the next 10 years, but what would it be over the next 25 or 50 years? And in my mind, it was a very obvious answer that it was going to be net positive. So why not?
Right.
Worst case scenario here is I'll have a tremendous amount of fun, meet a bunch of brilliant people, and eat some pizza.
Right. A lot of pizza.
That's a win. Totally. I'll take it.
Right.
And so it ended up being a great experience for us. The company didn't do as well as Fango did, financially, but we made a bunch of great friends. We made a bunch of great investments. After that, Joshi and I started doing regular investing in YC companies. I think at this point we've done over 30, 35, something along those lines. And we love it, because we understand the perspective. We understand how to build a business. We understand, the authenticity around being founders. And there's a lot of people that have lots of harsh things to say about your business, but have never built anything. And I always resented that as a founder, someone that's sort of afraid to be in the arena, telling you that you're not fighting hard enough or, that you don't have what it takes. And so we love being able to bring that perspective to the table.
It's awesome. Awesome. All right. As we near the tail end of this one, so you sort of eventually, you start this company, you sort of operate it. How did the TechStars, you end up running TechStars Bay Area. How did that overlap? And then, what was the journey?
Totally. So, 2019, COVID hits, we're running zero storefront. We managed to pull the company out of the tailspin that came from restaurants getting just absolutely pelted and hammered during COVID. And we end up finding an acquisition with Thanks. They came in and bought the business and the team and the technology, and we're able to really find a good home that had some meaningful upside, for the team and everyone else. And so it was kind of sitting around, not doing a whole lot, working on the transition with Thanks, but things were moving pretty quickly there. And so it was clear that I wasn't going to be needed, to keep pushing the business forward. And so around the same time, I actually was catching up with a friend, a guy named Ethan Austin from Outside Ventures. And Ethan had gone through Accelerate Labs with me. He actually was the founder in that program, along with Sean Harper from Kin, Sheil Manat from A Better Tomorrow Ventures, Sue Kim, who runs brilliant.org with the Chamath. I mean, it's just a totally stacked crew, right? And so catching up with Ethan, and he says, hey, TechStars is thinking about expanding into the Bay Area. This is going to be their first program, in the Bay Area. Maybe you should consider running it. And I thought, oh, that could be interesting. Like, maybe I'll go volunteer. That was I thought to myself. And so I ended up talking to the team. They said, well, hey, we're not necessarily looking for volunteers, but, if you're interested in the job of running TechStars for Silicon Valley, we'd be very interested in having that conversation with you. So I ended up interviewing. They made me an offer to join the team. And I thought to myself, what a great opportunity to come full circle, to basically be Sam and to be Troy for someone else. And, TechStars, unique in that the batch sizes are so much smaller. There's only 12 companies in a batch. So you really sort of have to know each company extremely well. And it tends to resonate with a different type of founder than what you commonly see in Y Combinator. I kind of think about it like undergrad and grad school, where it's like an undergrad, you sort of have like a RA and they help you move your stuff in and give you advice about life, and like you have mandatory classes and things to help you like do well for where you are. And then when you get to grad school, you're like, great, you're here, graduation's in 2 years, good luck. And YC is kind of like the latter, where it's like the resources are there, but you know, it's very much self-started. You got to kind of have to like figure it out on your own and sort of grab resources as you need them, because no one's going to sort of spoon feed you. And so TechStars, I think, represented certainly what I needed when I came through with sort of TechStars and Accelerator Labs.
Yeah.
And so the opportunity to do that for someone else was super appealing. And that's really what drew me in.
I'm so interested I've heard about TechStars for a long time. I've even helped out in LA and I've helped out with Sam, but I'm not sure I understand their business. Like, and when, you know, the crazy thing is hearing that TechStars came to Silicon Valley after TechStars had been established elsewhere, it's almost like, wow, I didn't expect that. I didn't know I thought it started here. And yet coming here to the Silicon Valley where there's so many other alternatives, it was not an easy challenge. That must have been Herculean, frankly.
It was quite difficult. I think I was fortunate because I had a lot of street cred. Right at that point, like I had built a company, became part of Grubhub, we went public. We had built, you know, subsequent companies that were acquired. I went through YC, I went through TechStars, we went through Google for startups with a different company that we had, you know, great outcome with. You know, was teaching Startup Garage at Stanford, advising the roll-off both both the Chen innovation program. So I had a lot of cred that when I, you know, went to a founder and said, you know, what you're going to get here is going to be different than what you get in 500 startups or in, you know, Pair VC or in Y Combinator, but you're also going to get me.
Yeah.
And that went a long way, because if you got me, it means you also got Hornick, and you also got, you know, Sam and Troy and all these other people that had become part of my community in the same way that we emphasize community here as a firm. So anyways, I think that was sort of the antidote to some of the flashy brand names and the bigger checks, is that you just had this authentic relationship with the founder.
Founder authenticity, once again.
Absolutely.
It's so interesting. I think of it as a contagion, this sort of entrepreneurial contagion that, you know, again, 15, 20 years ago, it was probably contained to Silicon Valley and a few other markets, Seattle, Austin, Texas, maybe a little bit of Boulder, what have you. And now it really is ubiquitous. And if you even look at our portfolio so far at Lobby Capital, you know, we've got companies in the Bay Area for sure, but we have a Vancouver company, Syracuse company, Chicago company. I mean, literally, we have a Cairo, Egypt company.
Yeah, that's right.
I just feel like this contagion of sort of entrepreneurship, and particularly tech entrepreneurship, seems to continue to expand. And it gets me just incredibly fired up, because I think it truly is the best way for a really brilliant person to exercise their business prowess, their creativity, their drive, their ambition. I know we're running to the end of our podcast. You know, you sort of got dragged into this Lobby Capital thing, this vortex.
I don't know if I got dragged, but yeah.
And absolutely, could not be more thrilled that we trapped you and we captured you. But you're now a full-time VC and you're sort of seeing a ton of deals. You've got an amazing network of things coming at you. You know, if you look forward 5 or 10 years, sort of what has continued to keep Colin happy, energized?
Yeah. I think the biggest insight for me has been that there's a certain amount of joy that comes from you making a mistake and learning from it and not making that same mistake again. Right? There's like pride in that and a sense of improvement and so on. Then there's this whole other level. It's like when you're able to democratize that learning such that other people are able to avoid the mistakes that you made,
can benefit from what
and make new mistakes, right? Like different ones. And I think that's the biggest legacy for me, like in this industry and in this space, is being able to come in and say, you know, I've taken a company and sold it and gone through IPO process. I've taken companies that have had soft landings. I've had ones blow up in my face. I've gotten into knockout fights with my co-founders. I've, built technology too soon. I've built technology too late. I've hired salespeople like that were the wrong person. I've had to fire hundreds of people in a week, and deal with, all the repercussions of that and so on. And so to me, it goes beyond just deploying capital, right? Because lots of people can deploy capital. It's more about deploying knowledge. Like, how do you deploy the knowledge that helps make the capital useful?
Yeah.
That helps you increase your probability of success such that you have the kind of inflection points that I had, right? That were life-changing for me and for my family and for my kids and my kids' kids. I think that is the legacy of what we do. It's not just writing checks. There's a lot of people that can do that. If I fast forward, I think that is the biggest impact that I can have. And also, I think during that process, maintaining our values and maintaining that approach that it really is about the people, right? You're going to make money on some deals. You're going to lose money on other deals. But at the end of the day, if you bet on high quality people who have shared values that you have, ultimately you're going to be net positive. And I think that's the piece that I want to index on. I want people to look back on and say, yeah, that was a positive bet.
Yeah. Yeah. It's awesome. Well, Colin, it's so fun. I could continue to talk with you for hours, and I will have the good fortune of being able to do that because you're my partner. But I think we should call this one to an end. So Collin Wallace, awesome. Congratulations and welcome to Lobby Capital. Thanks for spending this last hour or so with me. We have so many more conversations ahead of us. I can't wait for those to unfold.
Can't wait.
This has been The Fabric, a podcast by Lobby Capital. Make sure to subscribe so you can stay up to date with upcoming episodes and content. I'm Buddy Arnheim, and I look forward to our next conversation.